That's Enough Out of You podcast is sponsored by Todd John's Law. Unfortunately, bad things happen to good people, whether it's the result of an auto accident caused by the carelessness of another driver or being charged with a crime. Dealing with the aftermath of a personal injury accident or being involved with the criminal justice system can be extremely difficult. That's why, whatever you're facing, you should never go it alone. You need an experienced attorney who will stand by you every step of the way. Todd is experienced, licensed, trusted, respected, and guaranteed. No one will work harder or more diligently on your behalf, and he will personally handle your case from beginning to end. Located on Drinker Street in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, Todd has been representing the legal rights of Scranton and Wilkes-Barre personal injury victims and those accused of a crime for over 20 years. At Todd John's Law, the utmost priority is ensuring that your rights are always protected and that your case is resolved as quickly and fairly as possible so that you can move on with your life. Call Todd John's Law at 570-876-6903. With Todd John's Law, you will receive equal justice under the law. All right, and welcome to That's Enough Out of You, the podcast. And I am the podcast host, Bill Rader, joined by my partner in crime, my co-host, Sean Kane. Sean, how's it going?
Billy Raids, how you doing, buddy?
We're doing pretty good. We've got finally got nice weather here today in Northeast Pennsylvania. So
for now,
yeah, but that could change in 5 minutes.
It'll be pouring by the time we get done with this podcast.
Well, I'm sure it will be. But doing pretty good. And we have a returning guest with us today. Don McGovern comes to us, returns to the podcast, and he is from Memphis, Tennessee. Don, how you doing today?
Doing great. How are y'all doing?
Oh, doing
great.
Fantastic.
Great to have you back, Don.
Yeah,
well,
great to have you back on here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, was one of our most requested guests to have back. We had a lot of requests to get you back on. Your appearance on our show is probably one of our most viewed, most listened to shows. So we're really excited to have you back on.
Well, that's great. I appreciate you having me back.
Yeah, absolutely. So we got a lot to talk to you about today. Sean, you want to kind of get into some of the topics we have for Don today?
Yeah, we're gonna get into a lot. We'll see how much we could get through on the timeline here. But I want to start, Don, with Michael Franzese. He gave this statement. For people who don't know who he is, he's an ex captain in the Colombo crime family, and he's got a podcast. And he talks a lot about his life in the mob. And one of the problems I have with is he's real specific on certain things, but when he talks about the Kennedys or Marilyn Monroe, it's just all general stuff. So I have a statement here that you sent me, Don, that of what he said, and I'm going to read it and we're going to go through it, and we're going to basically pick it apart. But I want to start with the story, Don, that he said about his dad, Sonny, who was I believe an underboss in the Colombo crime family, that his dad had an affair with Marilyn Monroe. And do you want to tell that story?
Yeah, basically his story is that his father told him, this comes from his father, that he had an affair with Marilyn Monroe, that they met in the Stork Club, which I guess is a famous club in New York City. And a fellow named Costello, I don't know his first name, you probably do.
Frank Costello.
Introduced Marilyn to Sonny, and shortly thereafter, they began an affair.
And that would have been the same time that she was married to Joe DiMaggio, right? According to
Well,
story.
in another interview, he claims that his father told him that the affair occurred during the time she was married to DiMaggio, and that pretty well sets the date when it must have happened.
Right.
It must have been between January the 14th in late October in 1954, because that's when Marilyn and Joe DiMaggio were married.
Now, tell the story about what he said that his dad said about when RFK and Marilyn Monroe were allegedly having sex.
I love this. Apparently, while RFK and Marilyn were doing the horizontal bop, she shouted out Sonny Franzese's name. And this insulted and embarrassed and angered RFK. And according to the story, he jumped up immediately and called J. Edgar Hoover and said, this is what Mike Franzese said his father told him that RFK said, I don't know who this Sonny Franzese is, but put him in jail forever. And apparently this began the prosecution or persecution or the hunt for Sonny Franzese. And he claims that he knew what RFK said to J. Edgar Hoover because Marilyn told him that.
Yeah. Well,
which I find remarkable.
Well, of course, there's a lot of problems with that, but the major problem with that is, JFK wasn't president in 1954. So obviously Bobby Kennedy wouldn't have been attorney general then, and he wouldn't have been able to tell J. Edgar Hoover what to do.
It's not even, it couldn't even have happened that way. It would not have been possible.
See, this is the problem, Don, when these guys come out with these general statements, whenever you could pin them down to a timeline, then it's easy to pick apart their stories.
Yeah, that's the cardinal mistake they make when they give you dates to work with, because then it's easy to check it.
Except the problem, Don, is that most people don't check it. Most people just take, what these guys say as gospel, and now they've got this story, and this is what they think actually happened.
Absolutely. But, he also claims, Michael Franzese also says that Marilyn was having an affair with his father, RFK, JFK, Sam Giancana, and Rosselli. So how many people is that she's involved with at that time while she's married to Joe DiMaggio?
How did she have time to do anything
Is there anybody she didn't have an affair with?
I don't know how she would be able to walk.
Jeepers. And the thing is with the public, it's unbelievable some of the things the public believes, but you got to remember there's a segment of the public that believes that lizard aliens infiltrated the government. So you got to take it.
Well, that, and not only that, there's a segment that believes that the earth is flat.
That's true. And you can't, and I know some people, and you can't talk to them.
Oh,
You can't even get in a conversation and an argument with them.
No, they won't even listen to you.
Well, let's get in. So the story, I'm going to read this word for word from what Michael Franzese said, and then I'll stop it. And Don, we could pick it apart. But here he goes. He says, Bobby Kennedy heard about it, and he got very upset, and he told J. Edgar Hoover to go after my father, and that's the reason my father was so vehemently prosecuted. I would say it wasn't J. Edgar Hoover. It was really started by Bobby Kennedy. That makes sense. Well, first of all, Don, it's funny that he says about all these mob guys talk about this vendetta that RFK had against them. I mean, RFK's a attorney general going after a criminal organization. That's his job. It's not about a vendetta.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Bobby Kennedy was supposed to be doing, wasn't it?
Yeah. So then he goes on, he says, I can tell you definitely that's what happened. No, I can't. My father does tend to embellish things a little bit, but this makes sense. I do say if I had to bet on it, I'd probably bet it was right. But here's the deal. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say he basically has said in that group of words there that he doesn't even know if this happened.
Right. And then he basically said his dad embellishes things.
He admits that his father sort of embellishes things and doesn't always tell the truth. Well, to me, that renders anything he says after that totally worthless.
Yeah. A mob guy contradicting himself? Can you
imagine that?
Hard to believe.
So here's what he says. He goes on, he says, but here's the deal. Marilyn Monroe was going out with or had an affair with John F. Kennedy.
Wait a second. I gotta ask you, what do you think he means? I found this particularly funny. Going out with. What does that mean? Does that mean they had a date night?
Yeah, I don't know.
President of the States and Marilyn Monroe got together and went to the local cinema. I mean, that's ridiculous.
I don't know. Maybe he took her over to Bada Bing Club. I don't know. I mean, but he says, okay, he goes, now this is important. Listen to what he says here. He says, on 3 or 4 different occasions, she left him. Let me repeat that. She left him and then got back with him. Heard she was very much in love with him. Do I know that for a fact? No. But this is what I heard, and this is what's been reported. Again, been reported by who? By all these guys that are making stories up. But then he goes on to say she was jilted by John F. Kennedy. She didn't like it. He kind of passed her off to his brother, Bobby, and they had a pretty tart affair. Now, he just said that she broke up with him 3 or 4 times. But then he says that she was jilted by John Kennedy. So did he break up with her, or did she break up with him? Because he's contradicting himself.
Yeah, exactly.
So then he says, then he goes on to say, he said that Bobby Kennedy, they had a pretty tart affair. And he says, now that's a fact. I mean, we know that. She did have an affair with both Kennedys. Exactly. I mean, he said that's a fact.
What we know actually is that Marilyn did not have an affair with Bobby Kennedy.
Right.
I don't know what facts he's talking about. You know, he says that, but then he offers no facts at all.
No fact. And then actually from the evidence, Don, that you present your book that, you know, her relationship with John F. Kennedy, we talked about this last time, was probably just a one-night stand. That's the only evidence that we could go by.
Well, that's the only sexual encounter that can be verified. Right. A lot of people talk about others, but once again, not unlike this fellow, Michael Franzese, they don't offer any evidence either.
No.
It's just speculation, basically.
Now here's where it gets really funny. So he says, now that's a fact. And then Bobby Kennedy tried to break it off on the day of her death. Now let me set this up too, he says. Her phones were bugged. There was wiretap on her phone, and she had hired investigators to bug her bedroom because she wanted to have evidence on the people that were she was having an affair with. Allegedly, JFK was in her bedroom. Allegedly, Bobby Kennedy was in her bedroom. Was there anybody not in her bedroom? And then they talked, obviously, and they had all this information because she wanted to have it for whatever reason. She had. So talk about that, Don. Let's stop it there. So he says here that she had her phones bugged and everything.
Well, you know, that's been part of the Marilyn mythology for a long time, that her house was bugged. In fact, what he's talking about here is allegedly Marilyn hired Bernard Spindell and the other fella, whose name I can't remember right now, Otash, to bug her phones so that she could get evidence against Bobby Kennedy and use that evidence to marry her. But nobody has ever produced any of these tapes. Nobody has ever produced anything to prove that this is right or real.
Right.
Robert Slatzer and Jeannie Carmen said that Marilyn thought her phones were bugged, that she carried a bag of silver money around with her the last couple of years of her life, and she didn't use her telephones. She called from payphones. Now, if Marilyn wanted her conversations recorded so she could use them against Bobby Kennedy, why would she use payphones? And if she's using payphones, how could her conversations have been recorded? It just doesn't make any sense.
So wait a minute. The allegation is that she was trying to get evidence against Bobby Kennedy so that he would marry her?
Yes, so that she could browbeat him or force him into a marriage. That's right.
Oh.
That has been part of the myth of all of this bugging and telephones forever, you know. But none of it makes any sense.
Oh, it makes absolutely no sense.
But
No
this whole
sense.
thing doesn't make any sense. But let's
No,
get
but
back
why
to
would
it.
she
Go ahead, John.
suspect? Why would she suspect that her phones were tapped if she had hired people to tap them? Did she know the tapped?
Oh boy. It's amazing. It's amazing. But it gets even better. So here's what he says next. He says, maybe later on, she wanted to get even with everybody. As a matter of fact, she did tell people that. There were conversations picked up where she was going to blow the whistle on John and Bobby Kennedy. And even that she was going to blow the whistle on some things that she learned about the mob because she was going out with Johnny Roselli, who, as you know, I think reported back to Sam Giancana in Chicago. Well, okay, Don, let's talk about Roselli because let's talk about Alex D'Arcy, who was a good friend of Johnny Roselli's. And he co-starred in movies with Marilyn. And he said that Roselli had no connection to Marilyn Monroe, right?
Right. Yeah. Alex D'Arcy starred with Marilyn in How to Marry a Millionaire. And he was interviewed by Donald Spoto when Spoto wrote his biography in 1993. And D'Arcy told Spoto that Marilyn had no association with Johnny Roselli. She had no association with mobsters. And Spoto said he interviewed other people affiliated with the mob who told him Marilyn was never involved with anybody in the mob. And there is no evidence. This basically comes from two people, Milos Fariglio, who was a private eye hired by Robert Slatzer, and Jeannie Carmen.
Right.
You know, Jeannie Carmen claimed that she and Roselli traveled from Florida to California and grifted golfers on their way, that she had a relationship with Roselli. But then when you get to her memoir, she acts or writes as if she didn't even know Roselli.
And of course, John Roselli was he was real infamous in Hollywood and in Vegas, and he was in the press quite a bit back then. And there's no pictures to ever surface of Roselli and Marilyn Monroe ever, and it's just amazing that this rumor just keeps going on about Roselli and Marilyn, because there's no evidence whatsoever, and D'Arcy would know because he was good friends with Roselli.
Yeah, there's no evidence whatsoever that Marilyn was ever involved with any mobster. Giancana, right. Roselli. I've even heard she was involved. She was involved with Tony. Was it Accardo?
Tony Accardo. He was the actual real boss of Chicago. Sam Giancana was like the front boss.
Yeah.
He was like the guy that they put in charge to run the streets.
There's no evidence whatsoever to support any of that. And if you knew Marilyn, if you knew about Marilyn, Marilyn was an extremely kind, humane person. In fact, her first husband often told a story about he came home one day on a rainy day and he found Marilyn trying to pull a cow in out of the rain. She was scared the cow was in trouble because it was mooing.
Wow.
And when she lived in New York City, she heard about boys trapping pigeons and selling them to restaurants. So what does she do? She goes to Central Park and finds these boys and makes a deal with them that she will pay them what the restaurants would have paid them if they let the pigeons go. And she was always trying to save dead trees and dead bushes. You know, to me, to think that Marilyn Monroe would have associated with Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana, and that type of person is totally preposterous.
Yeah, it's inconsistent with her behavior that we know of.
Totally out of character with her. Yeah.
Exactly.
Just from listening to the transcript, Sean, that you're reading, it almost sounds like, Franzese was like making this up as he went along.
Yeah, he's just trying to get clickbaits. I mean, that's what he's basically doing. Because when he talks about stuff that he actually did and stuff like when he was actually a made guy, like in the 70s, like this is way before his time. And he's just saying this hearsay, but he's like real specific on things when he talks on the show. But this is just general, just, kind of putting stuff out there, see what sticks.
You know what's interesting about him too? I've seen an interview with him where he basically, gives Gianni Russo the business about his tales, that he doesn't believe anything Gianni Russo says. Ironic, isn't it?
Oh God, it's well. Let's get on. Let's see if we can get through this, because I'm like this is rough to even get through. But he says so she had a lot of dirt on a lot of different people. She certainly wasn't balanced. Her behavior was erratic. She was doing drugs. We know that, and people were starting to get very concerned about her. Now, there was a story, and I think there's credibility to that. On the day of her death, she had a violent argument on the phone with Bobby Kennedy. Okay, Don, let's stop it there because it gets real good from here. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, there's no indication anywhere that Marilyn spoke with Bobby Kennedy on August the 4th. I mean, I don't know what else to say about it, because he was involved in things in Gilroy, California.
Yeah, we're going to get into that. We're going to get into that because from here he goes on. He says, here's what he says. He says, he, meaning RFK, happened to be in San Francisco. He later flew down to LA. He was in that area, or in the area of Los Angeles, as I say, the day that she died or the day that she allegedly commits suicide. Well, first of all, I believe he lives out in California. He should know that Gilroy, California is not in the area of Los Angeles.
No, it's 310 miles north of Los Angeles.
Right. And then he says, here's another thing that I'm sure of. Now he's sure of this. The CIA did go to Johnny Roselli and ask Johnny Roselli for help to assassinate Castro at the time. And part of the plot was Roselli going to use Marilyn Monroe to get close to Castro and in some way use her to try to poison him. Now, Don, I read a lot of the declassified documents from the government on the CIA mafia plots to assassinate Castro. I've never seen Marilyn Monroe's name in any of the documents that were released, anything.
Well, she would never have been a part of anything like that.
And the thing is, just from all these years of reading about the mob guys, I mean, they can, this is the way they think. That like women to them are daughters, wives, or girlfriends. None of those people are allowed at a business meeting. Like there's no way like the American Cosa Nostra would they just wouldn't use a woman to assassinate, or it's just not what they do. It's just inconsistent with the thing. But to say that Marilyn Monroe was involved in those plots and then up the top he says he's sure of. Now listen to what he says next. He says, now that was talked about. I heard something about that. Didn't know if it was true or not. No, he just said he was sure of it. Now he doesn't know if he's sure of it. Like, this is like ridiculous.
Well, he's just talking.
Oh, yeah. Man. And then he says,
he's doing what he's talking just to hear himself rattle.
Oh, my God. And then he says, didn't mean that much to me. So you hear these things in passing when you're on the street and people talk about it, and they do on occasion. Now, first of all, it's just like in passing, like Marilyn Monroe was going to assassinate Castro. That's something they just say in passing, and he doesn't even, blink an eye. Like I wasn't interested in that. It's like, this is like ridiculous. And then he says, now let me tell you this. It's not like people sit down and say, hey, let's go over the murder that we were going to commit. It's talked about maybe in passing. Maybe a hint was given. Remember, I think I told you at one point, my father says hey, if we're going to commit a crime together, 30 seconds later, if you ask me about it, I'm going to say, I don't know what you're talking about. So right there, it's totally inconsistent with what he's saying. Do they either talk about it in passing or do they just not talk about it?
Right.
Like,
It can't be both ways.
Himself.
Yeah, it can't be hush hush and then people talking about it. Yeah.
Right. So then he says, so it's not like you sat down and had a whole discussion about what went on, but you might say it in passing. You might drop a line here or there, and those things happen, even with respect to Marilyn Monroe. Again, I didn't pay a lot of attention to it, but I started thinking about some things, and they do make sense. Well, I'm glad they make sense to him because I'm totally confused with all these contradictions. So here you have Marilyn Monroe hooked up with Johnny Roselli, which we know that's a lie, who in turn was under Sam Giancana, which, I mean, actually was under Tony Accardo. You had John F. Kennedy was going out with Marilyn Monroe. We know that's not true. You had Bobby Kennedy, who had an affair with Marilyn Monroe. That's not true. And JFK, which wasn't a long affair, also made another mistake. He was going out and had an affair with Judith Exner, who also was a lover of Sam Giancana. Now, Judith Exner is another one, Don. Like the stuff she says, like just she contradicts herself. She's another one that it seems to me was just trying to get her acting career out of the toilet and just came up with a bunch of crap. I don't know how you.
It's like Jeannie Carmen.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, I don't know too much about Judith Exner, but I've read a little bit about her, and she doesn't
I would put
seem
her right
like,
there with Gianni Russo. Put her right there with Russo.
she doesn't seem to be a very reliable source.
No. So here's where it gets better. We're almost done with this, and then we could go on. Thank God. So do you see this whole web here? This whole kind of, mix up of things that are going on, having an affair with people that are involved with the mob. I mean, this is a complex web that's going on here. So now Marilyn Monroe is acting erratic. She's making threats. She's saying things that shouldn't be saying. And Roselli and Giancana, from what I understand, they're getting upset. Now, it's interesting that a mob guy who was made in the 70s would know what Chicago guys were doing in 1960, in the early 60s. I mean, that's but then he says she's saying things that she shouldn't be saying about Roselli and Giancana. I don't believe that Robert Kennedy would have engaged the mob. I don't believe that. I don't believe Robert Kennedy would have engaged the mob to go after Marilyn Monroe because he was going after the mob. But I do think it's possible that John Kennedy somehow did get a message through that he wanted this woman out of the way. That's what I believe. Did I hear that? No. But you're trying to put some things together. So let me get this straight, Don. So what he's trying to say here is that the mob who hates the Kennedys, are going to help John Kennedy by killing Marilyn Monroe before she could expose him.
Yeah, well, that's just
and
totally illogical.
Still going to go after them.
That's totally illogical. It doesn't make any sense.
It's ridiculous.
I mean, if the mob wanted to entrap the Kennedys, John and Robert Kennedy, in a some type of a situation that would ruin their careers, and there was a woman, Marilyn Monroe, who was going to do that for him, why would he murder her?
Right. Exactly.
He would make sure she was alive and would arrange the press conference, I think. I mean, that's just silliness.
So, okay, we're almost done here. So then he says, okay, you might have used Joe Kennedy, earlier than that. And maybe Joe Kennedy was saying what's going on because John confided in him. Robert confided in him. I don't know, but there's something going on there. If you put these pieces together, it starts to make a little bit of sense. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's just talking about putting some facts together that can somewhat add up. And that's the end of his statement. I mean, we had Jim DiEugenio on, and he talked about the whole Joe Kennedy to the mob stuff, and he buried that in a half hour. He just destroyed it. So I don't know, Don. This whole thing is just ridiculous.
Yeah, not only that, Joe Kennedy had a very serious stroke in December of 60, or was it 61?
Right.
And he was pretty well incapacitated. Had problems communicating, could barely speak. So how in the world was he involved in all of these machinations and all these plots to kill Marilyn Monroe? I mean, it's ridiculous.
It makes no sense. And why would the mob kill her if she could embarrass the Kennedys? Like, it's just, the whole thing makes no sense. And everything he said, he contradicts himself. It's absolutely ridiculous. So anything you guys want to add?
There's another interview I watched in which he said that he said clearly that the mob was involved in Marilyn's death. Let me see if I can find it here. And a couple other things I'll get to in a minute that he's claimed. I think we had something to do with it, yes, and the we, he means the mob. He thinks the mob had something to do with Marilyn's death.
And that awful book Double Cross also says that too.
Well, a lot of this stuff is taken from disparate sources. Double Cross, a lot of people have written about this, and that's why, I think one reason is it's so confused in his mind. He doesn't really know what happened, and he's just making up tales.
Oh, he's all over the place. Yeah, he's all over the place.
But here's an interesting thing. He claimed that Marilyn was romantically involved with Giancana, and he spent the last full night that Marilyn was alive with her, which would have been Friday night, August the 3rd. Right. Well, on Friday night, Marilyn's best friend spent the night with her, and they went out to eat, Pat Newcomb. So did Sam Giancana go with them? Pat Newcomb spent the night at Marilyn's house with Eunice Murray. He then goes on to make this incredible assertion, that Johnny Roselli was the last person to be with Marilyn just a couple of hours before she died. How about that?
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Marilyn probably slipped into a coma. She probably died sometime around midnight, but she didn't die immediately. She lingered for a few hours, maybe as many as 3 hours. So was he there? Was he with Marilyn at 7:00 that night?
And of course, the FBI is following Giancana around, 24/7, and they don't see nothing, and they don't ever see him with Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense, He said that Marilyn died from a overdose of swallowed pills. Well, what did the mob do? Did they cram the pills down Marilyn's throat?
And that's different from what they say in Double Cross. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
But let's
I don't know Michael Franzese. He may be a fine guy. I don't know. But this stuff is ridiculous.
Is interesting. Yeah, this podcast, I mean, like I said, when he talks about stuff, that he actually, from the 70s and into the 80s and stuff, he's real specific and stuff. But this is just him trying to, get some clicks off of the Kennedy Marilyn Monroe thing, really, because none of this story makes sense at all. Bill, you agree with that?
Absolutely. Kind of, it actually reminds me, Sean, you know what I'm going to say here. Mm-hmm. There was an episode of The Sopranos where Tony meets his father's, lover.
Yeah.
And he kind of embellishes the stories that she told him about her, fling with JFK, and he's telling his buddies, Kennedy almost ended the marriage for her, and clearly he's just talking out of his rear end, and it sounds like that's what Franzese is doing here as well.
Yeah, this
Well,
is just,
people get very
ridiculous.
interested when you start talking about Marilyn and the Kennedys.
Oh, of
Sure.
course. Sure.
Absolutely.
Anything up on YouTube about Marilyn and the Kennedys, and people are going to watch it.
Yeah, I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
you
Absolutely.
need some clicks for your ads. Just throw in a Marilyn and Kennedy story there.
And the sad thing about it is he's got like 1 million subscribers. So you got all these people that are going to listen to this. And I mean, I don't know. It's you would hope people would be smart enough to just see through this, but again, I don't know.
Well, when I heard him kind of destroying Johnny Russo's stories, I thought, well, here's a guy with some brains, and then I start watching this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's just anything he says on the Kennedys. And I think a lot of this, Don, I think it has to do with a lot of these mob guys really hold a grudge, especially towards Bobby, because he went after them. They think it was a vendetta, and it was really just him doing his job. And I think that's where a lot of this stuff did start, where they would probably say stuff on the street. They would say, hey, we were dealing with old man Kennedy. We were doing this, and just to kind of embarrass them later on, and that's where I think a lot of this goes. And I think, there's other things too, but I mean, this is just ridiculous. But let's talk a little bit about how, he says about, well, actually in Double Cross, they said about Marilyn Monroe, did she owe her career to the mafia? Can you talk about that myth that's actually ridiculous?
Well, there's no indication anywhere that Marilyn was involved with the mob or the mob was involved in her career. Supposedly, I think it appears in Double Cross that the mob forced Columbia, the owner, the president of Columbia, to hire Marilyn and basically sign her to a lucrative contract, which is silly. She was going to be paid $125 a week. He signed her to a 6-month contract. But if the mob was involved in Marilyn's career, why did they allow her in the beginning of her career to get such rotten roles? Why did they allow her to be underpaid like she was?
Right.
And when Fox dropped her, why did they allow that? It just doesn't seem to make any sense. Why didn't they go to Fox and say, we're going to blow all of y'all's heads off if you don't give her the best roles, pay her a lot of money, et cetera and so forth? None of it makes any sense to me.
None of it.
And she started her own production company in 1955 with Milton Green, Marilyn Monroe Productions. And there's no mention of that in any of the books promoting that the mob was owning Marilyn's career. How could Marilyn start a production company on her own and the mob not be involved in it if they owned her career?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. There's no proof anywhere that Marilyn was involved with the mob. There are no photographs, no contemporaneous reports in newspapers. I've looked for it, and it does not exist. So the only conclusion I can come to is all of these tales about Marilyn being involved with the mob, about the mob did this, the mob did that, they owned her career. All of that is baloney, pure and simple.
And I think, Don, some of it has to do with, actually Sinatra, because, Sinatra, we know he had friends in the mob and this and that. And I think a lot of the stuff they just put by association, Marilyn Monroe, the Kennedys and the mob and stuff. But so let's talk about Frank Sinatra here for a minute. What do we know about, what was his relationship with Marilyn? Then all the rumors and stuff, what do we actually know was the factual relationship?
Well, they didn't really meet until I think late 1953 or early 1954. I've never been able to find an exact date when they met, but they were scheduled to appear in a movie called The Girl in the Pink Tights, and Marilyn refused to make the movie. And this was about the time she married DiMaggio. She married DiMaggio. They went to San Francisco. Then they go to Japan, and she goes and entertains the troops in Korea. I think Sinatra was a friend of Marilyn's, or they became friends. And I've read indications that Sinatra actually loved Marilyn and wanted to help her, and they actually talked about getting married. I don't know that any of this is true. It's just what I've read. But I think they had an intermittent relationship over the years, and I think that, Sinatra was a little bit of a, what would you say, a misogynist? Maybe that's not the right word, but he was a sexist, shall we say. And he did not like to see women drink, and Marilyn would drink occasionally. But I think they had a relationship. The depth of it, I don't really know. A lot of people do make a. Pardon me?
Some of the rumors, though, Don, have the relationship before 1954, correct? And they never met until 1954, as far as we could tell.
Well, there's all kinds of rumors that Marilyn met the Kennedys in the 50s.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of. Let's see, I forget which book it's in. I think it may be in The Mob in Hollywood, where they conflate Marilyn's relationship with Sinatra when she was with Columbia, and all of that gets conflated to the movie that Sinatra won the Academy Award for. What was that war movie? Anyway, that movie
I can't think right now. Yeah, I know.
From Here to Eternity is the movie.
Right.
But that movie wasn't even being made when Marilyn was at Columbia. Marilyn was at Columbia in 1948. That movie didn't get made until 1951. So how could Marilyn and Sinatra have been an item in 1948 during the time they were making From Here to Eternity, because it wasn't being made? And at that time, I think Sinatra was married to Ava Gardner. But they did become friends, okay? I don't think there's any question about that. But I don't really know that how deep the friendship was, or if they were really ever going to get married, or what. I know that Sinatra and DiMaggio had a falling out. I don't really know why, but I have a sneaky feeling part of the reason was because of Marilyn.
Mm. Now, what about the rumor, the myth that the movie The Godfather and the famous scene with the headless, the horse's head in the bed that had to do with Sinatra?
Well, that's all been debunked. The people that were involved in making The Godfather, or the people that were involved in, there was another movie, that's all been proven to be just basically made up. Has nothing to do with Sinatra. In fact, I think Sinatra sued some people over that. I think that he sued the BBC over some claims that they made that he was actually Johnny Fontaine. And I think he won his case. Yeah, he even said he was not Johnny Fontaine. He was not.
Right. So basically what we could conclude here, that from the evidence, Marilyn Monroe had no association with the mob, with individual mobsters. They had nothing to do with her career, and she didn't have an affair with any of the mobsters. And I think the evidence could definitely back that up. So, Billy, you got anything before we move on to the autopsy?
No, I mean, other than, just the fact that there was actually a physical, or almost a physical altercation between Sinatra and Mario Puzo, which, we've talked about that, John, in a restaurant where Sinatra had his bodyguard, try to remove Puzo from the restaurant where he was eating. So,
yeah, I read a little bit about that. I did.
Yeah.
Now that you mention it, yeah.
Yeah. But
Sinatra wasn't happy being sort of placed in that role of Johnny Fontane. He wasn't
he was
happy at all.
furious about it. No, he was furious about it. He did
Yeah.
not people. He didn't want that public perception that that his mafia connections got him that role and helped his career. He didn't want that at all.
Well, the faulty syllogism has always been Sinatra was involved with the mob, Marilyn was involved with Sinatra, therefore Marilyn must have been involved with the mob.
Right.
Well, that doesn't work.
Right.
It's faulty, Yeah, I don't think there's any question Marilyn had nothing to do with the mob. Nothing whatsoever.
I agree. So, Don, let's move on to the autopsy. So Thomas Noguchi, who we talked about in the show, because he also would later do the autopsy for RFK, which, Jim Diagino talked about that. The autopsy that he did on JFK is considered like a model, autopsy that people could review because it was done so well. And in a lot of these conspiracy stories, it's very inconsistent with Noguchi. They either have him as incompetent or they have him as a mastermind, covering things up. I mean, he can't be both. So let's start with the autopsy. Let's start with Thomas Noguchi.
Well, Noguchi was a well-respected pathologist surgeon.
Right.
All of this stuff about Noguchi being incompetent began with Norman Mailer's book and was carried forward by our good friend Robert Schweitzer in his 1974 publication, The Life and Curious Death of Marilyn Monroe. He basically accused Noguchi of creating a bogus autopsy, that the autopsy was totally made up, which is kind of interesting when you stop and think about it. But then when you go to his book in 1993 called The Marilyn Files, he totally reverses it. Noguchi becomes a great autopsy surgeon, a great pathologist.
And then, of course, there was
everything I've ever read about the autopsy and pathologists who have reviewed it during the 1982 investigation, during the 1982 reinvestigation by the San Francisco's pathologist. 1985, they re-reviewed it. Boyd Stevens, that's correct.
Right. Okay.
Everybody has said that was a well-done, competently performed autopsy for 1962. In fact, a lot of pathologists have said it's much more than what normally would have been done in the 60s on an autopsy. Well, the big issue with the autopsy, I think, was the fact that even though Noguchi dissected and sent samples of Marilyn's organs to the pathologist for testing, he did not test them. He tested the blood. He tested Marilyn's liver, okay? And this was Abernathy. His name was Abernathy, the head toxicologist. And he said that it so overwhelmingly pointed to an ingested overdose, a large ingested overdose, that he didn't see any reason to test further.
Right.
Noguchi admitted that it was an error of oversight, that he did not follow up and make the pathologist test him anyway, okay? But in the meantime, the case had been closed. They had ruled it a probable suicide, so they closed the case. Then in the 60s, the standard operating procedure was after a case was closed, they destroyed all of the organs that were kept, et cetera, and so forth. So when Noguchi finally called Abernathy and asked him about the testing the organs, they had already been destroyed. That's what prompted everybody to think or to say that it was a cover-up, that the destroyed organs mysteriously disappeared. But that's not what happened at all. They were destroyed as part of the coroner's SOP.
Now, some of the findings, Noguchi found that there was no evidence of physical trauma, correct?
Correct. He found one small bruise on her hip, right above her buttocks on the left side. But he said it was so small that he felt like she might have been bruised by bumping into a piece of furniture. You know, Marilyn was very fair-skinned.
Right.
And doesn't seem to me to be out of the question that she might have bumped into something and caused a bruise. He looked for needle sites, injections, and did not find any. He found no evidence of any trauma to her body, really. No evidence of trauma to her head. Her body had not been punctured, and basically the toxicology reports indicated that Marilyn died from a drug overdose.
And he also found no evidence that she recently engaged in any sexual intercourse, correct? Which is unbelievable if you listen to all these stories.
Correct. Well, you know, Norman Mailer said that she was with the lover the night she died that probably killed her. You know?
Right. Unbelievable.
Many other people have said that. There's one podcast I think out now, it may be a year or two old, where they said that Marilyn was battered, beaten, and raped the night she was murdered, which
unbelievable. And there's no evidence at all. You just throw this stuff out there and with no evidence to back it up whatsoever.
There's no evidence of anything really, of any kind of foul play. There's no evidence that Marilyn was injected. There's no evidence that Marilyn was given an enema. There's no evidence that Marilyn was killed with a suppository as claimed by not Sam Giancana, but Chuck Giancana.
Chuck Giancana, right? And that's a double cross. Yeah, unbelievable. Right.
The funny thing about the people that write about this is they don't tell you the whole truth about the autopsy. They will tell you the amount of barbiturates that were in Marilyn's blood, but they don't mention the amount of barbiturates in her liver. The reason they don't is because that totally blows out of the water any possibility that Marilyn was injected. Okay?
Right.
She had 4.5 milligram percent barbiturates in her blood. In her liver, she had 13 milligram percent, almost 3 times or even over 3 times more than in her blood. If she had been injected intravenously, as has been claimed, it would have been reversed. She would have had more barbiturates in her blood than in her liver. And the fact that she had such a high level of barbiturates in her liver indicates she didn't die immediately. She lived for maybe 3 hours, as long as 3 hours after she ingested the pills, okay? Mm-hmm. But they don't ever tell you about the concentration in her liver, because, the whole James Hall story that he watched Dr. Greenson stab Marilyn in the heart, and in the process of breaking a rib while he did it, and injecting her heart with some kind of unknown fluid, which killed her immediately. And there are a lot of people who actually believe that. Even though there was no indication of any kind of needle tracks through Marilyn's chest, there were no indications of any broken ribs or anything like that. When you swallow medicine, it goes directly to the portal vein, and from the portal vein, it goes directly to your liver. When you are injected with the drug, it eventually gets to the liver, but it goes through systemic circulation first. But when it goes to the liver, barbiturates go through a high level of biotransformation, and it stays in the liver. So it's entirely consistent with a higher concentration in her liver than in her blood is consistent with a swallowed overdose. She wasn't killed with an enema, and she wasn't killed with a suppository. In fact, according to my research, it's almost impossible to kill somebody with an enema. You can do it, but it's not easy. Marilyn took at least 2,500 milligrams of barbiturates the night she died. Any suppository large enough to contain 2,500 milligrams of barbiturates would not have dissolved quickly, and the motion of drugs from the rectum into the body is totally different than it is when it goes through the stomach. Anyway, the long and short of it is there is no question in my mind that Marilyn swallowed the pills that killed her.
Or the mob or Bobby Kennedy forced her to eat them.
Yeah, shoved them down her throat.
You know, Don, he brings up Bobby Kennedy. One thing that we didn't talk about with Franzese, with his crazy claims there, with Bobby Kennedy, there's documentation. I think we mentioned this on the last episode, that, you know, Bobby Kennedy, there's photographic evidence showing him in Gilroy, California, when Marilyn was killed, is correct?
Yes, they landed in San Francisco. When I say they, that means Bobby Kennedy, his wife Ethel, and four of his oldest children at the time. One of them was Bobby Jr., in fact. Landed in San Francisco late Friday afternoon, the 3rd. They were met there by the Bates family, and the Bates family drove them to Gilroy, where they stayed the rest of Friday, all of Saturday, and then they left Sunday morning after Mass and went into San Francisco and spent some time with Paul Fay Sr. in San Francisco before Bobby gave his speech. I think his speech was that Monday. But there are 10 photographs that were published by Susan Bernard in 2011 of all the activities that went on during that Saturday. And there's no way Bobby Kennedy could have snuck off or left and gone to Los Angeles without being missed. There's just no possible way that could have happened. Right. And I saw an interview with RFK Jr. With Megyn Kelly, and she brought up the whole Marilyn Monroe thing, and RFK Jr. said, you know, we were in Northern California that day, and my father never left. Those photographs were taken all during the day, morning, midday, afternoon. The Bates said that after the children had been fed, they put the children to bed, and then they ate. I think he said starting about 8:30 or 9:30, and they didn't retire to go to bed until after they had eaten dinner. Well, I believe by that time Marilyn was already a non-responsive body. She was already moving into a coma at that time. So let's say Bobby left after they ate dinner. By the time he could have gotten to California to L.A., Marilyn would have been probably dead.
Right.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous. It's like nobody. You ever hear anybody talk about these photographs?
No, nobody mentions them. Nobody talks about them.
They ever talk about
they know it's a game over.
Right, and
yeah,
it's more.
Yeah,
it's sexier to talk about this kind of nonsense with absolutely no evidence. Evidence to the contrary.
But people like Anthony Summers, I think, contributed mightily to this. He interviewed the Bateses.
Oh, I agree.
He interviewed the Bateses, and then he never said anything about what they said, what their testimony was. He just basically dismissed it as being unreliable. He would rather listen to informants for the LAPD than the kind of people that the Bateses were. You know, he was a big-time attorney in San Francisco, John Bates was.
Right.
If I have to choose who I'm going to believe in that situation, I'm certainly going to believe the Bateses over a bunch of informants in L.A.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and not only that, all the testimony that Summers put forth to prove that Bobby Kennedy was in Los Angeles that day, there's not one eyewitness report. It's all hearsay. It's all secondhand or third hand.
And of course, Don, after all the stuff Summers did and all the dirt he threw, he changed his tune now, right? Like he just says now that there's no evidence that Bobby Kennedy.
There's no evidence that Marilyn was deliberately killed, I think is how he puts it.
Right, after throwing all this dirt out there.
Yeah, but his books, you know, I got the 1985 version, I got the 2012 version, and they're not the same. They are not the same.
Unbelievable. And one last thing on the autopsy, Don. So the blood test found no alcohol in Marilyn's system, right?
None, and that sort of blows up the old theory that put forth by David Hyman that Marilyn was drunk the day Bobby Kennedy and Peter Lawford showed up, and she attacked Bobby with a knife.
Unbelievable.
And RFK and Lawford had to wrestle her to the ground to take the knife away from her. No, she was not drinking that day. There was no ethanol in her blood, none.
So, in your opinion,
certainly disproves Hyman's theory, doesn't it?
Right. I think
there are other people who have claimed that Marilyn laid around all day, all that Saturday, in a drunken and drug-induced haze, which is not true. It's not true.
Right. So your opinion, Don, then we could go with the evidence shows that, you know, it was most likely a suicide, and that could be concluded.
Well, in 2000, I think it's 2003, the History Channel put out a program about this, and there was a doctor, a pharmacologist on there named Nicholas Cozy, and he did some experiments to try to replicate what would have happened when Marilyn, swallowed the pills. You know, one of the big controversies has always been there were no pills found in her stomach. And everybody has always said, well, you know, she couldn't have swallowed all those pills and not have any left in her stomach. Well, she lived long enough to digest all of the pills. In other words, she didn't die immediately, and her system kept working until she died. But Nicholas Cozy's experiments proved two facts. One, the Nembutols dissolve and break down very quickly. In fact, all of the Nembutols that Marilyn swallowed, let's say she swallowed 25 at one time, would have been dissolved within 10 minutes.
Right.
And she would not even have been asleep yet. She might not even have been asleep for 10 more minutes. But by the time she was asleep, all of the pills would have been out of her stomach. They would have left her stomach and gone into her intestines. And even Cyril Weck has said he doesn't see a problem with the fact that Marilyn didn't have any pills in her stomach. And other pathologists, Boyd Stevens or Stephen Boyd, said basically the same thing when he reviewed the autopsy results in 1982.
Yeah, he's the guy from San Francisco.
Right, Boyd Stevens is his name, right? Yeah, I don't think there's any question. There's no question in my mind that Marilyn committed suicide. People are going to hold out for the fact that it was an accident, but Nicholas Cozy said he doesn't see how Marilyn could have taken intermittent doses of the Nembutol without falling asleep. Mm-hmm. At some point, she would have to fall asleep, which would have prevented her from taking all the other pills. But that wouldn't have killed her, right?
Right.
He said he believed that Marilyn took all of the pills in one big dose. That's what I believe.
This has been really great. I mean, we're going on an hour here now. We got, we've taken up a lot of your time here, but I think we did a great job, dispelling a lot of these myths and this just complete garbage that's out there. The way they trash Marilyn Monroe's reputation is just a disgrace. So
Yeah,
I
it's
think we did a
pathetic.
good job, but it's bad. It's really bad. But I think we did a really good job here, and fantastic information you're giving us. But we're not going to be able to get to everything that I want to talk about tonight. So hopefully you come back and there's more I want to discuss. But the last thing I want to talk about tonight is Marilyn Monroe's diary, the myth of the diary. What evidence do we have that this thing even existed? And if
Well, it didn't exist until 1974.
And that was started by Slatzer?
Schweitzer, yes. Schweitzer invented the prop as evidence or as a motive to kill Marilyn. In other words, they'd had no motive. What was the motive to kill Marilyn? Was she to say she was going to squeal on the Kennedys that they were having an affair? That would never have brought the Kennedys down, never.
Right.
But to say that she had a diary with all of these nasty secrets, going to kill Castro, going to do this, et cetera and so forth.
UFOs.
Right, UFOs, everything. That's the motive. But the diary didn't exist until 74. Nobody in Marilyn's inner circle, and that would be DiMaggio, Newcomb, Patricia Newcomb, Eunice Murray, and various others, never mentioned the Greens, for example, Amy and Milton Green, the Strasburgs, never had mentioned that Marilyn had a Little Red Diary. It was created by Robert Slatzer. But then he told two completely different stories about how he came to know about this diary. In the first book he wrote in 74, he said that he and Marilyn went to Point Dume and she produced a red diary out of her purse and handed it to him and asked him to read some of it, which I find particularly weird. But anyway, then in his 1993 book, he claimed, or excuse me, let me back up. He told Summers that Marilyn produced a diary out of a large shopping bag. And along with the diary, she produced a rubber band bound wad of love notes from RFK, written on Department of Justice stationery. But he didn't mention the love notes in the first book.
And of course,
the diary is a MacGuffin. Okay, it has never been
rewards
seen.
Offered, right?
Pardon me?
There's been rewards offered for this diary, and nothing's ever.
Yeah, Milos Periglio offered $10,000, and I think there was another guy whose name I can't recall now that offered six figures for this book.
Right.
It's never been produced, and everybody that has written about it has come up with their take on what the contents were. In other words, they quote from it.
Right.
But when you read what Marilyn actually wrote, and you can do that now in that book called The Remnants, you see obviously that what these people say Marilyn wrote about and the way she wrote and the way she actually wrote, there's a big gulf between them. They don't match up at all. Lionel Grandison Sr. said he read the diary over a couple of days in the coroner's office, and it disappeared from the coroner's safe. Which I don't think there's any credibility to that at all. He told two different stories how he came to possess the diary. The diary does not exist. It never existed. Right. There are only five people. There are only five people who supposedly saw it and read it.
And who would that be? Slatzer, Carmen?
Slatzer, Carmen, Ted Jordan, Samir Mukadeen, or Lionel Grandison Sr., and Michael Rothmiller.
Okay.
But Michael Rothmiller was the most recent person to have claimed that he saw the diary, he read it, and he copied excerpts from it. But when you read what Rothmiller says is in it, and you read what Lionel Grandison Sr. said is in it, they're totally different. They're reading two different books, obviously. Or they've put words in Marilyn's mouth that are totally different. I don't believe that. I'm sure the diary never existed.
Yeah, and just using common sense. I mean, if it did, and with all these crazy stuff in it, with the Castro hits and UFOs and everything else, somebody would have capitalized on it.
Well, of course, if anybody had the diary, they would have. It would excuse me. It would probably sell for millions of dollars.
Sure, absolutely,
no question. But it was created by Bob Slatzer, and I think probably Capel had a little bit of a hand in it as well.
And now,
because when Will Fowler dropped out of the book writing conglomerate that Slatzer had put together, they moved their operation to New York City, and that's where Capel lived. And
talk about Capel for a second, Don, because he wouldn't be a full-fledged FBI agent, but he was an FBI asset, I guess you would call him, right? In the anti-communist.
Yeah, he worked for the sheriff of Westchester County in their anti-subversive division, I guess it was.
Right.
And he claimed that he was an investigator for the FBI. I think it was more than that. I think he was friends with J. Edgar Hoover.
Hoover, right.
That's what I think.
And of course, he had a political agenda there to embarrass the Kennedys and get dirt out.
Well, he wanted to destroy Bobby Kennedy. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, that whole thing, the strange death of Marilyn Monroe, that 80 or 90-page pamphlet was all designed to smear Bobby Kennedy, and he was one of the first to call into question the autopsy results. In fact, he never mentioned the toxicology results at all. He basically played them down. But he was out to kill Bobby Kennedy's chances at being president.
Right.
No doubt about it. And I have copies of contracts between Will Fowler, Robert Schweitzer, and Frank Capel to write that book. And I don't believe Schweitzer ever wrote that book. In fact, I know he didn't. It was written by Will Fowler and other people that got involved in writing that book. That book is totally made up.
Don, who was it that started all the rumors with the UFO stuff with Marilyn? Was that Schweitzer too?
Well, no, that was Milos Fariglio, really.
Okay. But wasn't he hired by Schweitzer?
He was hired by Schweitzer, but
right.
Basically he kind of broke away from Schweitzer and started writing his own books, right?
Okay.
But a lot of that UFO stuff was furthered by Donald Burleson when he wrote a book, Marilyn. What was the title of it? The UFOs and the Murder of Marilyn Monroe, which sort of grew out of an article he wrote for MUFON. Marilyn Monroe, the death of Marilyn Monroe and UFOs, is there a connection? And it's all based on that CIA wiretap memo that was announced to the world by Spiriglio in 1995, where it talks about the conversations between Dorothy Kilgallen and a fella that wasn't even a member of Marilyn's inner circle.
Right.
I can't remember his name right now. But, that document is, I think, uniformly accepted now to have been a hoax.
Was that Rothberg? Is that who it was, Rothberg?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's it, Rothberg. And when you read that memo, it doesn't really say the words UFOs, flying saucers, aliens. Those words are not even used. It talks about dead bodies.
Is that the one with James Angleton's name on it? Didn't he sign that? Okay. As soon as you mention Angleton, everybody's going to go crazy.
Yeah. But anyway, Burleson, wrote a brief book about it, and he goes off the deep end. Said Marilyn probably, to get the level of barbiturates in her blood and her liver, she had to consume over 100 pills. I doubt that, but Cozy did some arithmetic about that, and he came up with a 2,500 milligram dose is what would have produced the results in her body, the level of barbiturates in her body.
And Don, was Burleson the guy that said there was a recording of JFK and an Air Force officer, and JFK was angry over the CIA killing Marilyn Monroe?
Oh, that's Stephen Greer.
Oh, that was Greer. Okay. And of course, there was never any recording ever produced. It was just, he's just throwing hearsay out there.
Well, no, it's just none of these recordings have ever surfaced. None of them. Not a one. Even Franzese mentions recordings. Conversations were picked up. He's talking about recordings when he says that.
Right, but no.
But he doesn't have any. That's amazing. I mean, Don, we've covered a lot of ground here today. We kept you on for quite a while, and we appreciate you coming on. I know, Sean, there's still some things you want to get to, so we'll Don, if you're kind enough to come back at some point, we'd love to have you back.
Sure, I'd be happy to come back. I always welcome the opportunity to, in my own clumsy way, to set the record straight about Marilyn, because it's all what people say about her is, and I read articles every day that I can't believe. I can't believe people actually write it and people actually believe it.
Well, you do a fantastic job, Don, of getting the truth out there. So we thank you, and we appreciate your time here. Once
Absolutely.
again, great job.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you having me on, and you want me to come back, I'll be happy to.
Absolutely, definitely.
Great. Thank you so much, Don. This has been again another fantastic visit with you. We appreciate it, and we'll talk to you. We'll talk to you again soon.
Sure, I'll be looking forward to it. Y'all have a good evening.
All right. Thank you. You too.
Thank you, Don. All right.
Thank you. Bye. I enjoyed it. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.